like to welcome everybody to the 21st Sustainable City Series event. Another great turnout. And my name is Patrick Puma. I'm the director of the Urban Design Studio. And we're located at 507 South 3rd Street. And we're part of the University of Louisville. Tonight's sponsors. Oh, yeah. Whoops. That's why this is here. I'd like to thank tonight's sponsors. This event wouldn't be possible without the Tree Commission and the generous support of Christina Lee Brown. As well as the University of Louisville's Urban and Public Affairs, which the Urban Design Studio is based in. I'd also like to thank our in-kind sponsors, which would be Ramsey's Cafe, who did another great job with the food. Tiny Brothers with the coffee, to economic development and innovation. Thanks.
Quick roll here just to welcome you on behalf of Mayor Fisher, who's out of town and couldn't be here tonight. It's like, I don't know, maybe I should be. The mayor is continually impressed by the number and the passion of the people that come out to the Sustainable City Series. That's all right. This is better. We'll blow you away. And tonight is going to be great. I've had two opportunities to hear brief discussions by Dr. Stone, and I'm eager to sit through a third. He was doubting that earlier, but I'm ready for more. You know, I think as a planner, I always put trees in new developments for aesthetic and emotional reasons, or attachments to trees. And it's just, that's an undervaluation of trees. And you're going to hear so much tonight that you'll want to run out and plant trees, which is, of course, what we want you to do. I think that we have to take away from tonight ways to grow and get smarter, and we have to get smarter faster. And so hold on to your seats. And now I'm going to introduce Katie Schneider and Henry Heiser, and they are co-chairs of the Tree Commission and Eat, Live, and Breathe Trees.
Thank you, Patty. Welcome you all. Katie and I am greatly honored to be appointed by Mayor Fisher to be co-chairs of the Urban Tree Commission, Louisville Metro Tree Commission, and it's a great honor, and it is a board that is fully representative of this very large community. And your presence tonight really means a lot to us, because this is a real kickoff to a huge community effort as we move toward improving our community, the lifestyle, and the aesthetics. Dr. Stone spoke today at the commission meeting, and there are a couple of takeaways I want to mention, because I'm so fired up, and I know you will be too after you hear his presentation. And first of all, we're going to hear a lot about our tree canopy, or the lack of it. And there are three takeaways I just want to mention. One is we need to overhaul our tree ordinance and enforce what's there already. It's very important. We need to adopt a culture, and that there shall be no net loss in tree calipers or trees. And three, and very important to me, trees are a measurable, significant infrastructure. Thanks to Patrick and the Urban Design Center. I'm thrilled that you all are here, and Katie will introduce Dr. Stone. Thanks.
Good evening. This is incredible, and it's just so exciting because it shows that this community is ready to address a very serious issue of urban heat islands and our shrinking tree canopy. So this is fabulous, this turnout. I'm going to take a few seconds. I hope you're probably going to sit there wondering where I'm going with this, but I do think you need to know about how we came to invite Dr. Stone. The Louisville Metro Commission learned about the research of Dr. Stone through his Louisville connection. He is married to Elizabeth Chandler, who grew up here in Louisville and who has family here. And she has a first cousin named Chris Chandler, who is very, very active. He's here with trees and the environment. And he just, once he heard about the Tree Commission, he signed up for committees and he's been there and very, very active. And we were at a presentation by some U of L graduate students about the urban tree canopy and the fact that ours is shrinking and that urban heat islands are a problem. And Chris, who was in the audience, raised his hand and said, you know, I know someone who's done this incredible research on urban heat islands and climate change in cities. And his research of several out of 50 large metropolitan areas has shown that Louisville is in really bad shape and trending very negatively, and that we need to be concerned. And so we thought, you know, and obviously there is a good connection between a lack of trees or a shrinking tree canopy and a problem with urban heat islands. So we've got to have them to town. We've got to have them come. And of course, I'm sure Chris probably sold him a little short and say, oh, he'll come for free, you know. It's his fault. But we had no budget, and so we thought, well, we want to bring him here. And of course, Christy Brown stepped forward. I mean, I barely got her on the phone for 2 seconds. I'll pay for it. He's coming. And the reason is because she cares so much about this community and about our environment. And it isn't just this event today that she supported us. She really is the catalyst that got the Tree Commission, the Louisville Metro Tree Commission going. I don't think without Christie's pushing and without the Festival of Face focusing on sacred air, making that connection to trees, I don't think we would be here. So I cannot tell you, Christy Brown, how much we appreciate all that you do. Hi, it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian Stone. And if you aren't convinced that trees are crucial to the prosperity of our community, you will be after you hear him. And if you aren't convinced that we have some issues here that need our attention immediately, you will be after you hear him. Dr. Stone is an associate professor in the School of City and Regional Planning at the Georgia Institute of Technology, where he teaches in the area of urban environmental planning and design. He holds degrees in environmental management and planning from Duke and Georgia Tech. Stone's work on urbanization and climate change has been featured on CNN and NPR and in publications as Forbes and USA Today. He is the author of the very new book, The City and the Coming Climate, Climate Change in the Places We Live. And if you'll hold that up, it is for sale out there. And it's a wonderful work. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Brian Stone.
Thank you, Katie. I appreciate that. Katie's had the, maybe we'll call it a pleasure of introducing me 3 times, so she was not reading that little note she had. She has memorized every word of that. Thank you, Henry, Patrick, for this amazing setting, and Patty for your comments. I am indeed thrilled to be here. I very much consider Louisville to be an adopted city for me. I've been coming now for about 20 years. I think this is my 20-year anniversary of coming to Louisville. And as was briefly touched on, this may be the first important kind of public scientific endeavor that ever originated over a meal with in-laws. This literally was a meal, a Christmas holiday dinner. And my working assumption as the only kind of non-blood related relative there was that I can say anything I want and it will be disregarded, completely disregarded. And so I ventured to discuss that Louisville had been kind of migrating up in this index we have of cities that are warming rapidly. to Chris Chandler, and I should have known that he would run with that. And so here we are. I found myself in an airplane coming here yesterday, and I'm thrilled to be here. So we're going to be talking about trees and cities and climate change, as we see here, and the three basic topics I'm going to focus on. The first won't surprise you. It's on vinegar and baking soda, why the world warms, and those things are related, so I'll talk about that. King Louis XVI and climate, you have to get the namesake of Louisville in here, so I've done that. About essentially why we need to be worried about this problem, what we can learn from Europe's experience, particularly European cities, from dealing with the rather extreme heat waves. And then finally, cooling down the Ville. I do have the lingo, I've been around long enough that I think I can say that with a straight face. So vinegar and baking soda, why the world warms, and particularly cities. I like to start my talks about climate change and the urban scale with this particular slide. This is taken from a 1953 edition of Popular Mechanics, and it highlights two things that I think are important about when we talk about climate change in general. The first is that it shows in this highlighted couple paragraphs here that there was a perfectly reasonable and sophisticated understanding of the global greenhouse effect in the 1950s. This is a mechanism that's been understood for a very long time. Since the late 19th century, the science of global scale climate change has been very well understood, and so that's shown here. But what this also shows that I think is equally important is that the editorial decision on the placement of this article actually follows the piece on the Dutch entertainer riding the tiny bike. And I don't want to detract from what this gentleman has achieved here. I mean, this is an amazingly small bicycle. I don't know if you, I mean, this is the bicycle he's riding here, and so that's amazing. But this does not spell, potentially global cataclysm to the same degree as this might. So placing that to follow that, I think, was a unique editorial decision. And what it says to me is that in the 1950s, global scale greenhouse effect was understood scientifically, but it was seen to be somewhat of an anomaly, of a curiosity, not really newsworthy, at least not as newsworthy as this. And so today, that's not true anymore, at least certainly in the scientific community. This is a well-understood phenomenon, taken very seriously. But the urban scale phenomena of warming is a little different, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. And I think we still think about the urban scale phenomenon, what we call the urban heat-island effect, as a climatological anomaly. It's something that's there, it's understood, it's scientifically proven, but it's not that important. It makes us a little uncomfortable. I think it's much more significant than that. So I'm not going to talk a lot about global scale climate change and the greenhouse effect, but I just want to point out exactly where we are here and how this is different from what's happening in cities and how it relates to it. And so we see here that the temperature trend since the late 19th century pretty consistently increasing over time. And so this is what has a lot of people in the scientific community worried. It's just a few degrees here. For global average temperature, that's a big deal. That's significant warming over time. And then we have this association here with CO2 concentration. So CO2 is the most predominant greenhouse gas that's increasing, and we see this association over time. So sometimes when I give this talk, there's still questions about, well, how do we know these things are really related? And I'm not going to try to prove that to you, but I'd like you to try to prove it to yourself. So what I want you to do is get yourself a lab assistant. This is my lab assistant. His name is William. I've had him for almost 7 years now. He's very reliable, very enthusiastic, particularly if you give him a treat afterwards. So what William is holding here are two mason jars. Two mason jars. You might have this in your pantry. And so, in one mason jar, you've got a little vinegar there in the base of it. Here you've got a little vinegar over here in the base of this one. And then you put about a teaspoon of baking soda, just in one of these. Just in one of these. Screw down your little tin cap, stab a poultry thermometer in both of them, and put them in the sun. And so what happens here is this is starting to bubble. This is vinegar and baking soda, and so it will react. It releases carbon dioxide into the mason jar. Put it in the sun. And then what will happen is, if you leave it out there for about 10 minutes, come back and look, and the mason jar with the baking soda vinegar will be hotter. And if you do this 100 times, 100 times out of 100 times, this will be hotter. this will be hotter. And so this is just it's a physical relationship between greenhouse gases and warming. If we didn't have the global greenhouse effect, we wouldn't be here. We'd be a lot colder. We need this to survive. What's happening is, of course, that we are amplifying this. We are, through our release of additional greenhouse gases, we're promoting this. And so this is what gives scientists heartburn, is that what we see here is this is basically where we are. This is the temperature record that we just looked at a minute ago. We've got a longer record here, but this is what's been measured, just a black squiggly line. If we go back in time, we can use temperature proxies for these. These are very reliable proxies, ice cores, tree rings, very, very reliable back several centuries. And we can see there's oscillation. It gets hotter, it gets warmer. It always has. There's oscillation with carbon dioxide, and that's always been the case. But we're kind of bounded within this period between about 1 degree of warming or cooling. And then we get into the more recent period here, and we break out of that cycle. And so this tends to be actually very significant and rapid warming compared to what we've seen in the recent past. When we think about climate terms, this is still pretty recent. And then when we look forward, it gets more problematic. So what we have here are different scenarios about how much greenhouse gases will increase. That depends on us, depends on what we do. And so you can see here that even the most optimistic scenarios that are probably out of reach now, we're getting to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times where we have been in the last 15 centuries. That is very rapid warming, and it will create many, many challenges for us, already is. So that's where we are globally. In cities, we are confronting an additional challenge, and that's what we call the urban heat island effects. And so this is my city of Atlanta, and this image makes me particularly proud because it's extremely hot. It's got a huge heat island. And so what you see here is the things that are white. This is the Georgia Convention Center. It's got a big black roof on it. That's not a good idea. We've got surface parking lots. Things that are white are really hot. And so these are areas that are warming not because of greenhouse gases, but because of land use activities that simply absorb more solar radiation to make the city hotter. And there are 3 of these mechanisms that drive the urban heat island effect. The first is cutting down trees. And so that's really what we're here to talk about tonight, cutting down trees. And tree canopy in cities and why it's so important. So when we cut down trees, we heat up the environment because trees provide a natural cooling mechanism to cities. So we can go back to our high school science classes. Maybe you took a class on ecology or climate, and you saw this graphic. If you took the class in high school, the sun will have a smiley face. If you took this class in college, the sun will not have a smiley face because we take ourselves very seriously. But the science is the same here, and it's pretty simple. It's a pretty simple process. Trees channel moisture. They absorb moisture from the soil, and that travels up through the tree or any green plant, and it's released by the leaves themselves. And in doing that process, essentially the evaporation of water at the surface of the leaf is known as transpiration. That process absorbs a great deal of solar energy, and it transmits that energy, it conveys it up aloft. And so vegetation, trees, provide for us a natural conveyor belt that's taking not only moisture up to the upper atmosphere, condensing, forming clouds, and raining, it's transporting a great deal of heat away from the environment, from the land surface. And so trees are critical for cooling cities. What we do, we make it even worse. We cut down trees and then we put these things in. We put in roads. Black asphalt is a good choice here if you want to burn the soles of your feet. Red roofing shingle. There's no structural reason to have black roofing or red roofing unless you lived in Northern Europe, many centuries ago. This is kind of a legacy of that migration. And so that increases the amount of solar energy that's absorbed at the surface. And so not only do we lose our natural cooling mechanism, we make things hotter, and then we emit a lot of not only pollution from our cars and our industry and burning fuel, we emit a lot of heat. And so that contributes to the urban heat island as well. So we have these 3 things. None of these things relate directly to the global greenhouse effect. We have a lot of greenhouse gases that are emitted here, but these things independently warm cities. With no greenhouse effect, cities would be a lot hotter, and they have been for a long time. So we have these 2 things going on here. We have the global greenhouse effect, we have the urban heat island effect, and most of the scientific attention is focused on the global phenomenon, and we have measurements of how rapidly the planet is warming every year. And so we wanted to ask the question, well, because we know cities also have their own climate mechanism, are they actually warming faster than the planet is? We know they're hotter, but are they warming over time faster? And so we wanted to ask this question. So we looked at the 50 most populous cities in the U.S., and Louisville, fortunately, is in that group. We try to cover all the regions of the country. And so we established two basic trends that we're interested in. The first is what's happening outside of these cities. If I look at rural weather stations outside of Louisville, how fast are they warming? And this is what this orange temperature trend shows us. This is known as a temperature anomaly. And this is simply the variation from a long-term average. So the zero line here is the average temperature across the U.S. from 1950 to 1980. Okay? So any areas here that are above the line suggest a warming trend from a long-term average, and then areas below are a cooling trend from a long-term average. So the economic trend here is warming. This is outside the 50 largest cities in rural areas. This looks just like the global trend. So rural areas in the country are warming up just like the planet because greenhouse gases are diffuse, and the rate of warming is largely consistent in most places. So then we can look at the urban trend, and we superimpose that. It's the red curve. And so what we find is in these 50 cities across the country, this is the average trend here. We've averaged all the data from these cities. And they're all hotter every year. So that just tells us the urban heat island exists in these cities. They're all warmer. Okay? They're all warmer. We can also look at the difference in what's driving these trends. These areas here, above the zero line, underneath the orange curve, we believe this warming trend here is because of greenhouse gases. We think that's the global greenhouse effect. Anything between these two curves in this space is the urban heat island effect. In every year, the urban heat island effect is the dominant driver of warming in cities. So if you want to cool down Louisville, if you want to cool down a city, you have to focus on both of these things. And the most short-term option is going to be the urban heat island effect. It tends to be the most powerful of these two mechanisms. And then we can look at the rate of change. And the rate of change suggests that, yes, cities are not only hotter, they're not only hotter because of the heat island effect, they are warming more rapidly over time. And so if we think the planet as a whole is going to warm by 7 or 8 degrees over 100 years, cities are going to warm by more than that. They're going to warm by a lot more than that. And so we need to be planning for that in particular. So what we do is we rank how rapidly cities are warming, right? We have this index. This is not a joke. We have an index, and our index is a measurement not of how hot these cities are. This is a measurement of how rapidly they're warming relative to what is around them. Okay? So Phoenix is certainly hotter than Louisville. Phoenix is certainly hotter than Louisville. But if we compare Louisville in terms of its warming rate to what's around it, Louisville is warming more quickly than what is around it. And so that is problematic. Louisville's not only #1, it's way out there. And so this is why even in-laws will listen to you when you present these data. Okay? So what's most important here, to my mind, is not that Louisville is so far out there, but that Louisville is part of a class of cities that is warming much faster than the planet is. And so to counteract that, we need to be thinking about what we can do. So why should we be concerned? So King Louis XVI in climate, to be honest, Louis XVI has nothing to do with climate change. He's not responsible in any way. He's been dead a long time. But he has this linkage with Louisville, and so it's a nice way to segue into lessons from Europe and what we can learn from Europe. So 2003 in Europe, there was a very intense heat wave. A very intense heat wave that lasted for a long time, lasted most of the summer. And so what we see here is satellite imagery centered on France and these really dark zones here, temperature anomalies. So this is how the additional heat on top of normal temperature. So it was about 10 degrees Celsius warmer in these darkest areas. That's about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. So if it's typically about 85 degrees in the summer in August in Paris, then it was over 100 degrees. That's really hot for European cities. And so what we saw during this heat wave was regularly temperatures in excess of 100 degrees. London has been maintaining temperature records since the 17th century. So they got on this bandwagon early. And they have never broken 100 degrees. London broke 100 degrees in August of 2003. And there were a lot of bookies who lost money. Because people will bet on anything. And they certainly bet on that. So, but this was problematic not just because the high temperatures were unusually high for Europe, but because of the low temperatures. The temperatures in the middle of the night were so high. 80 degrees is a very high minimum temperature. So if it's 4 in the morning, it's 80 degrees outside, that's really high. And so this is what creates the problem for heat-related illness. You can live in a desert environment and be exposed to high temperatures during the day, that's not a problem. But if you are, for a 24-hour cycle, exposed to high temperatures, your body is really taxed by that. And if that's the case for several days in a row, you can really start to experience the symptoms of heat-related illness. In particular, if you live in a part of the world where air conditioning is not prevalent. And so very few people have air conditioning in most of these European cities. And so they were being exposed to very high temperatures over a prolonged period of time. And so particularly in the cities were much hotter because of the heat element effect. So what this is, sorry to be morbid here, but so these are the emergency response systems in Paris and other European capitals were overwhelmed by the number of people dying. There was a very large number of people dying over a very short period of time. These are where unidentified bodies are still today in Parisian cemeteries because they simply could not handle the crisis that was unfolding. We talk about the actual numbers of deaths. It's rather shocking here. This is across 12 countries. These are excess deaths. These are deaths in excess of what you would expect. And so Italy and France were the epicenter. About 20,000 people in both countries died over the course of a single summer from hot weather because it was hot outside. They didn't die from heat stroke per se. They died from heart attacks, respiratory disease. Heat aggravates pre-existing conditions in a very significant way. So this is a very large number of deaths. These are the most medically advanced societies in the world. And so this is a real, I think, a real indication of the types of issues we will be confronting as the world warms and as cities warm. This is the most deadly natural disaster in a developed region of the world ever in the modern era. I won't ask for a show of hands, but typically when I do this, most people actually had never heard of this event. So I compiled a particular index, which again is a little morbid. Maybe that speaks to me. But this is called the books to bodies ratio. And so this is showing how many books have been published on these various events associated with various death tolls. So in 2003, we had severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, or SARS outbreak. Many people have heard of that. There's a lot of media coverage. Globally, the death toll wasn't that high. Not to minimize it, about 700-800 people. And a handful of books have been written about this, and rightfully so. Katrina, about 1,800 deaths. This was horrific. We all watched this unfold. About 200 books you can find on Katrina. And again, it's a topic that merits that. 9/11, not a natural disaster, certainly a man-made disaster. About 3,000 deaths in total. Almost 500 books have been written about 9/11. And that makes a lot of sense. Even recent events, the tsunami in Japan last year, about 20,000 people died. Again, in a very highly advanced country, very highly advanced emergency response system. We already have 3 or 4 books here. Heat wave 2003, you add up this death toll from all these, it doesn't add up to, it's maybe half of that. I don't think it's even half of the number of people who died in Europe in 2003. I cannot find a book in any language in any part of the world that's been written about this. And so what this says to me is that heat, just everyday heat, high temperatures, is something that we really underestimate as a threat to us. We really don't appreciate how deadly heat can be. Today, heat waves kill more people in the United States than tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, or all those things combined. Extreme heat kills more people every year than any other form of catastrophic weather or all other forms of catastrophic weather combined. And so as the world warms, as cities warm, this is a real concern. It's a real concern for cities. So other issues here, not just public health related, but infrastructure. So all these things happen in Europe. These are pictures from elsewhere. This is in New Zealand last year from extreme heat, buckling of rail lines, melting of asphalt, buckling. This is an interstate in Illinois in 2006. All these materials are engineered to withstand high temperatures, but not for prolonged periods of time. And so if we get to a point where, in the not too distant future, Louisville is regularly over 100 degrees, you're going to see lots of infrastructure failures. And so that's something that, as in the realm of planning, we need to be thinking about in a very serious way. And this is where the economic costs become rather serious. Other critical infrastructure, electricity. So this is an image from space of night lights. This is the same summer, 2003. We had the largest blackout in North American history over the Northeast into Canada. This was brought on by a heat wave, not the same event in Europe, but it was a shorter duration heat wave, and a massive power outage as a result of that. It only lasted about 24, 36 hours. If you lived in Manhattan, you got trapped out of subway, trapped in an elevator shaft, you didn't like that. The people who didn't walk home over the Brooklyn Bridge had a big party, actually, in New York, because they had to give away all the food. They had no refrigeration, so people actually just stayed there. And over 24 hours, it wasn't that big of a deal. About 6 people died from the heat wave, from heat-related causes. But this was a very short period event. If we think about a concurrence of what happened in Europe this summer and what happened in the United States, you can see that if you were to have an intense heat wave and a multi-day blackout, how critical that becomes very quickly. Just ask yourself what you would do to get out of the blackout zone. You can't pump gas, you can't fly planes, you can't get on a train. So that becomes a significant threat, particularly if you can't deliver water. So this is a significant threat this summer. This is something that very much is part of where we are now. We rely, of course, in this country on electricity for air conditioning, and that's our main protective strategy for dealing with heat, is air conditioning. Grid failures, this is the number of blackouts a year in the United States, increasing by about 15% a year. And so to rely on a electrical grid to protect us from heat alone is a risky proposition. This is not because of heat itself. I mean, heat contributes to blackouts, and it's part of this. But this is mostly just because we have an antiquated electrical grid system across the country. So there's a vulnerability here, and it's a vulnerability that part of my message is that cities should take this very seriously. It should think about very seriously whether they are prepared in the present period to deliver water and critical services during a blackout. So other bad news for Louisville, I hate to dwell on this. So this is another study, not one of mine, projected heat-related deaths in major U.S. cities over the current century. Louisville comes out at the top of this as well. And so this is not because this is not solely because of things like trees or the urban healing effects. Louisville's in a portion of the country that gets a lot of stagnant weather systems. So there's some bad meteorology here, unfortunately. But that just kind of compounds the challenge of dealing with these particular issues. So, cooling down the bill. What can we do about these challenges? There are a lot of things you can do at the local level. The most effective things you can do are at the local level. You don't need an international agreement. You don't need national action. You can do these things yourself. So tree canopy. Louisville is unique in terms of its tree canopy. We can measure this in several ways. If we look at the metropolitan area, we can compare across other cities in the region. Atlanta and Chattanooga still have about 50% of their tree canopy cover. And so that's a healthy number for an urbanized region. That's a healthy number. Nashville, Charlotte, in the middle tier here, getting approaching 40%. And then Louisville and Cincinnati, around 31% at the metropolitan level. What distinguishes Louisville is if we just look in the city itself, the urbanized area of Louisville, this is one of the lowest numbers you're going to find east of the Mississippi, about 7–8%. So that's a very low tree canopy number. That makes Louisville particularly vulnerable to heat waves and climate change in general. Trees, again, provide that natural cooling mechanism for us, and when we lose that, when areas around us heat up by a few degrees, we heat up by double that. And so Atlanta is actually in a better position, as horrific as things are in Atlanta in many respects, to deal with rising temperatures than Louisville is. And so that's why this new tree commission is so important, and the work that's ongoing is so important. It's about urban beautification, which is a wonderful reason to plant trees, but it's critical green infrastructure, it's public health infrastructure. It's a very important focus, so I hope the city will think about it in that sense. So what can be done? What cities do is they develop climate action plans to deal with climate change. And a number of cities have developed this. Louisville has developed one, and we're going to look at this in a moment, how Louisville stacks up compared to other cities. And what you see here, no, this is the good news part. What you see here is Portland's climate action plan. And so what's highlighted are these various actions that are being taken or incentivized, and they almost all relate to energy efficiency. And so what cities are trying to do is reduce their greenhouse gases, which is a critically important thing to do. But this is almost entirely focused on the global phenomenon of the greenhouse effect. Very few of these provisions focus on the local urban heat effect, which is the dominant driver of warming in cities, at least in large cities in the U.S. So we asked the question, if we look across various cities and their climate action plans, do they have provisions to increase vegetation? Do they have provisions to increase surface reflectivity, the things that actually cool cities down? Reducing greenhouse gases in Louisville is a critical thing to do, but it will not cool you down at all, unfortunately. It will not cool you down at all, particularly if you're doing it alone. So you have to focus on things we know that cool down cities. So planting trees, tree planting, wonderful. Preservation of trees, highly, highly effective. If you really want to get fancy, you can do vertical gardens. You might want to do this on your house if you're very experimental here. Works very well. Green roofs, these types of strategies are very effective in not only cooling down the building on the interior, but cooling down the outside air. Albedo enhancement, reflectivity, things like white roofs, cool paving, very effective in offsetting heat gain. It makes the city more reflective. It reflects away that solar radiation. So we asked the question, how many of these cities are pursuing these strategies? We looked at the 50 largest cities. 8 of these cities have no climate planning at all. They're not preparing at all. And then the rest do, and they're all focused on greenhouse gases, and that's critical and important, and needs to be part of all of these planning efforts. If we look at vegetation strategies, Louisville looks very good in terms of their climate plan, in terms of what is being proposed, and has a very sophisticated description of the urban heat island effect and what you can do to mitigate it. And so Louisville compares very favorably to other cities. The blue cities here are promoting vegetation enhancement, but they're doing it to reduce greenhouse gas emissions alone, not to cool down the city itself. And so those are slightly different policies. And then cool roofing, cool paving, Louisville again looks very good. So the limitation here is that these types of plans are often recommending policies that need to be adopted by the city. Policies like we need to have a tree planting commission, we need to have a tree ordinance, those kinds of policies. At present, the policies Louisville's recommending in the action plan haven't been adopted. And so there's not a lot of teeth here in terms of the climate action plan. If we look at the types of policies that are on the books, particularly with respect to trees, they tend to be rather weak. And so we looked again at the 50 largest cities. We looked at whether they have a tree ordinance, and a tree ordinance is a public policy that essentially tries to protect existing tree canopy. And so in most cities, if you want to cut down a tree for whatever reason, you need to get a permit from the city. And the city will want to know why you want to cut it down, and there'll probably be a permit fee associated with that. And that fee is used to plant additional trees elsewhere. You have the option to plant more trees on your property if you're cutting them down. And then you don't have to pay a fee. But so what we basically do are comprehensive tree ordinances in the green. These are cities that regulate trees on public and private property. Blue are cities that regulate trees just on public property in the right-of-way, so street trees. And then orange are cities that have a landscape ordinance, which tends to be the weakest mode of protection. It often doesn't have enforcement mechanisms, and that's where Louisville is. Just a handful of cities. Louisville, Chicago really doesn't even belong there because they are so aggressive about their street trees. They're really in a different universe. So there are very few cities that are here, and I very much believe that this is describing why the tree canopy is so low in this city. It's probably directly associated with the policy. So the good news is Louisville is aware of this and is moving toward this rapidly. This is what the Tree Commission hopefully will be all about. So I will conclude with just a handful of recommendations. Louisville needs to inventory the tree cover. You need to know what's on the ground now. You need to know where the gaps are in your canopy if you're going to form a tree plan, whether it's preservation or planting. So you need to have a tree ordinance. Louisville would benefit greatly from having a very effective tree ordinance to protect what remains, because it may be a small percentage, but that percentage that you have left is more critical than anything else. I mean, that's doing a lot of work for you. The little bit you have, you don't want to lose it. So a tree ordinance. You need to plant trees. You need to plant a whole bunch of trees. Maybe you get Big Bird to come out. In New York, Big Bird comes out and we plant trees. Bette Midler comes out. I don't recommend this footwear for tree planting when I plant trees. But in general, so there are a number of cities like New York, Los Angeles, Denver, Houston have million tree planting campaigns. These are really effective ways to address things like heat issues, city beautification, you really need to have less of Big Bird and Bette Midler and more of just neighborhoods doing this for themselves. You will never be able to just the city do this for you. This has to be at the neighborhood level. Neighborhoods have to be bought in. Nonprofits, foundations have to help fund this. But there will be an array of benefits from this if Louisville moves in this direction. I recommend that you think about not just trees for the sake of trees, but you think about managing heat in Louisville, because like all large cities in the U.S., Louisville's heating up. And this is going to present economic challenges, quality of life challenges. We see it here on surface temperatures throughout Louisville, that over time, the downtown area and around it is getting hotter relative to the rest of the region. So the heat management plan that's focused on both trees, materials, cool buildings would be effective. And then finally, I just want to note that tree planting and thinking about heat management shouldn't be thought of just as a new burden on city government and residents. This should really be part of a broader economic development, quality of life plan. I get to come to Louisville on a regular basis, and I've just been, over the years, amazed at what Louisville's already doing in this respect. And so the waterfront, the projects that are happening, as somebody who's in planning, I study cities, this is very impressive stuff that's ongoing in Louisville. Integrating a tree plan and tree planting along with these initiatives would be a perfect fit. It's part of a greater sustainability goal that makes a lot of sense. I would point to Chattanooga, selected by Outside Magazine last year as the most desirable place to live in the country. Are you serious? Did you go to Chattanooga 20 years ago? This is impressive. Chattanooga was the last place 20 or 30 years ago that people wanted to move. And they have done amazing things. They've done it by emphasizing their waterfront, the amenities. They've converted bridges, like Louisville's doing, to pedestrian ways. They have extensive bicycling networks. They are making in-town, downtown housing affordable to young people. Louisville seems to have a great deal of potential for that. So I want to see Louisville out Chattanooga. With that, I will conclude and would be thrilled to have any questions if you have them. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Yes, sir.
If the prevailing wind, west to east, comes across the city and Louisville's densest urban heat island areas are in the west part of the city, is there any benefit to downtown of the tree planting in the south and east where there's available land?
So the question is, given if prevailing wind patterns are west-east, is a great question. So is there a benefit to downtown if you're planting trees to the east? Is that what you said? Or either way, downwind essentially. Sure. And so the greatest benefit is going to be immediate where you're planting the trees for sure. And so you want to be looking at the region, you want to be looking at like a heat map that I showed and also a Kingery map, looking at where the gaps are. Also, what are the most vulnerable populations that you want to protect as well? So, do you want planting trees in parks is great, but proximity between the canopy and the people who are most vulnerable should be the number one, I'd recommend, step. But there's plenty of evidence to suggest, particularly with a heat island generates its own wind pattern, and it will disrupt the regional pattern. It tends to draw in air downtown, so it creates a large thermal. So if the downtown district is the hottest, and it usually is, you'll have lots of rising heat down there. That's drawing in wind and heat from around the region. And so planting trees even around the city can benefit downtown. There is evidence to suggest that. It's a great question. Yes?
This one's kind of geeky.
I like geeky questions. I'm a geek.
There was a study recently that said Louisville had a very poor density of parks compared to its population. We used to have a reputation for being very high density of parks. And come to find out, the data was skewed because we went from an urban area to a metropolitan area officially. And so when you show the data that we had the highest temperature differential, and you had urban versus metro, how literally should I take you? Is the fact that we have this whole county as our city boundary, does that skew the data?
Not in my case. Not in what I'm showing you. So the question is there a difference in how we've looked across cities as far as temperature change? Are some cities measured at the metropolitan level and some are just measured at the urban level? We use the exact same approach to all cities in our data set. We use the exact same approach. So it's a great question. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Have you seen examples where you can
encourage the grassroots formation, because what I hear seeing is not only the money that needs to flow into the economic district, but also the support of the grassroots so that the multiplier is higher. What seems to be examples of how that has worked well?
And so my answer directly is tree planting. I mean, we've been trying to galvanize community support for climate change planning for a while now. And people struggle to get their minds around something that feels like it's at the North Pole and feels like it's out in 2100. And so if you can connect the climate issue to the issue of quality of life in your neighborhood, and that you, by planting trees in your neighborhood, you can actually make a difference against rising temperatures that we can measure in our lifetime, I think that is a very powerful way to do it. Most people really like trees. Most people think trees make their neighborhood beautiful. They think they make the city beautiful. And so, you know, most tree planting habits is driven by beautification. And so if we can also put the message out there that it's simple infrastructure for public health and stormwater and flooding and all those things, I think that makes it all the more powerful. But I think making it local and involving the people in the neighborhood, again, the city cannot do this themselves. So relying on the grassroots to do this. Sometimes there's seed funding, and neighborhoods can compete for seed funding to help get their tree planting started. I mean, those types of things work well. But I think just connected to where people live is the most powerful. Yes?
Is there some way to calculate the canopy space that the electric company slaughters? The value of it?
Sure. I'm sure.
They say it costs X amount per mile for the very electric line.
Sure.
How much is that space worth?
Yeah, and so everybody hates to see the decapitated trees, right? I mean, I see that. I get the questions about the power company pruning trees under the power lines, and so that's a particular complex issue because we need the power lines. They are expensive to bury, right? So what I would say is, that's not Louisville's problem. I mean, that's an aesthetic problem at the neighborhood level. We don't like it, but Louisville is not heating up because of the power lines. It's just not enough space. It's not enough space to account for what we're seeing. I mean, the dearth of tree canopy, the amount of tree canopy that's impacted by power lines is a very small percentage of the total tree canopy in the city. Yes?
I'd say the urbanized area particularly, there are small houses on small lots, and the power lines front and back. And so the percentage of available.
Sure. At that scale, at the parcel level or the neighborhood level, certainly that can make a difference. But citywide, I would be surprised to find that would be a significant issue. But I mean, that's just you need to. That's why it needs to be a broad initiative that brings in LG&E. I mean, that they should be, and I think would be, advocates of this. I mean, for example, if you cool down the city, can LG&E avoid building a new power plant? If you actually are successful in really distributing trees to the community, you could save the utility a great deal of money. And many utilities support tree plants, and they fund tree planting. And so those things should go hand in hand. Yes, sir?
I know every tree helps, but what percent of the typical urbanized area needs tree canopy? To have a positive.
Right. So that's a great question. And I don't have an answer for you. It's not known, and so there's not a basic statistic that you need to have at least 30% of your downtown to cool it down. The issue is that tree planting as a tool to deal with climate change is a relatively new idea. There's been lots of tree planting in the past, and it's been recognized as good for the heat island, but it's mostly, again, been about urban aesthetics. So we can use computer models to look, and so what I recommend to the commission today is that scenarios be run that use computer models as the only tools that we have to see how many trees and where they're put, and look at different scenarios and see what the benefit is. Because if you're going to spend a lot of money to plant a lot of trees, you definitely want to have some evidence it's going to work. And so that's the only tool. I wish I could answer your question more specifically. You need 30% downtown, but I don't think we can reliably answer that. I mean, the more the better, of course, as you said. Yes, sir.
What I consider here a good positive thing, when I ask them a negative thing, they say, I don't like to break the leaves. So I have to put them all plastic bags.
Absolutely.
One thing maybe a city could do is, blowing sucking trucks that come by and help up with the leaves.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's great.
Yeah, so the comment is that Not everybody gets excited about trees because there are maintenance costs and there are maintenance issues. The leaves fall, you have to rake up the leaves. The leaves also clog up the stormwater sewer. So, I mean, cities are invested in those issues as well because they will bear some of the price. And so that's true. I mean, this is not a cost-free endeavor. My argument is that the benefits greatly outweigh the costs, but it's a very fair cost. So I'm going to rely on somebody else to tell me when time is up. I mean, I'll take as many questions as you will ask, but I don't want to keep people longer than I should. So somebody will tell me it's important. There was a hand right in here. Yeah, please.
So I was thinking to solve the problem of the power lines, you could plant fruit trees in residential areas, so you get food for the people. The trees are low, so it doesn't conflict with power lines. So it's like a win-win-win.
Absolutely.
Have you had experience with that?
Not in the situation of power lines, but so the observation was, why not plant fruit trees under the power lines, and they're understory trees, so they're not going to interfere with the power lines, and you also get the benefit of the fruit. And so again, this is part of the synergy of a broader planning initiative that's focused on a range of issues. And so urban, local food production, wonderful. Why shouldn't that be part of trees? And now there are lots of cities that are now collecting wild fruit that is not collected by folks in parks, in public spaces, and are taking that to food pantries. So yes, ma'am, in back. We don't have a lot of questions back.
Oh dear, now you can really hear me. A couple comments. I want to emphasize the importance of tree maintenance, not just tree planting.
Absolutely.
Secondly, I want to make sure that everybody here knows that Louisville has one arborist, one city arborist. We used to have, I think, 3. That arborist's budget for tree planting each year is 0. 0. So that's something that you might want to contact the mayor about and ask that we increase that budget from 0 to something. Third, I think it's really important that this group, which I'm assuming are some of our top tree advocates in the city, that this group understand that while the mayor deserves kudos for forming the tree commission, and he's done a lot of really great things towards sustainability issues, he has been heavily influenced by some developers who are currently working to dismantle the land development code, which we've worked very hard through Cornerstone 2020 and work that a lot of you all probably did and a lot of the public did in order to create requirements for new development to have vegetation, to be able to preserve trees instead of just cutting them all down when they have new development. These are being dismantled. It is a really serious issue, and it would be great if the mayor heard from the people in this room and that he understood that this is something that's important to us, that it's not just about preserving the canopy we have, but it also has to do with the new canopy that we hope to develop. So, thank you.
You mentioned that there wasn't a book yet about the 2003 heat wave. Do you have any plans to write the first book?
No, but the first chapter of my book that's out here addresses it. So there hasn't been a book on it, but there's a chapter on it, and it's available to you right now.
So in the analysis that you've done of the heat island effect, have you looked at how the temperature differs within the city in different neighborhoods to be used as a guide as where you get the most bang for your buck?
Yeah, others have. I have not. So those studies are out there. There are not many of them. Part of it is collecting that data. So you don't have air temperature measurements typically around the city, right? We only have a few weather stations at most, and so you have to use satellite data and surface temperature. And so that's available to us. There've been a handful of studies I've looked at that. I've got a graduate student now that's doing just that for his dissertation, and so he's looking at population vulnerability and surface temperature hotspots and seeing how vulnerable the environment is to heat wave events. So that's part of it. It's a great observation, and we need to do it. And if Louisville moves forward in this direction, I would encourage that kind of study. Exactly. Yeah.
Greater Louisville's getting ready to start putting down hundreds of acres of pavement for the Bridges project. Would pavement selection type really contribute to reducing the heat island?
Sure, it sure would. Now one, I don't know, when you say bridges project, I don't know if I know what that is, but if we're talking about a bridge or a handful of bridges, you know, that in and of itself is not going to radically change climate, but locally, sure. I mean, that in pavement selection, you know, you have pretty significant and important engineering standards for a bridge, obviously. But things like the reflectivity of the pavement, you can typically engineer across a range of hues, whatever the material is. So I would think they could do that, but I'm not an expert on that. We need an engineer for that, for sure. Anybody else? Okay.
I noticed that there is not much soil. You know, there'll be concrete and the tree in the center.
Sure.
And after the new development is done, those trees in about 5 years are starting to die in the crop.
Right.
And so do these tree ordinances address things like that?
Yeah, so the question is, you might notice downtown, you might even notice out in subdivision that the tree wells, where they're planting the trees, particularly in a downtown district, are small, right? They're typically small. And so, and that's a huge problem, and it's also a huge problem out in new developments where they typically will not only clear cut forest if it's there, but remove topsoil. So topsoil will be removed and sold as part of the grading process. And then you'll come in and they'll put trees down in what's known as hard pan, which where I live is just clay. And trees don't like clay. So yeah, those are huge problems. And urban trees in general have a very short lifespan. And so species selection, but the planting process itself, providing that space, you know, that can be addressed in tree ordinances, and many tree ordinances address that in great detail. I'm going to close off the questions there because you guys have been very attentive and patient, and I'm thrilled that you come out. If there are folks that have any questions, want to come up and ask me, I'd love to chat with you about it. But I'm going to otherwise bring this to conclusion. Thank you all so much.